Hey, Cheyenne East. Let's talk about kicking arguments. Kicking arguments is a very important part of policy debate because it is how we realize the concept of debate as a funnel. If you remember back to one of the first videos you watched, debate should start out big and then slowly get smaller and more focused, so all of the positions that you have argued for along the way ultimately don't make it through to the end of the round. The only way that can happen is by kicking them. As always, we start with the basics. What is kicking an argument? Kicking an argument is a term that refers to a team announcing that they will not ask the judge to consider a specific argument that they made in the round. So it's jettisoning that argument from the debate. We no longer care about it. When can I start kicking arguments? And the easy answer is anytime after your team's first speech. So beginning from the second affirmative constructive throughout the rest of the debate, you theoretically can kick positions and arguments. But as we will talk about later in this video, the strategy behind kicking arguments will usually dictate that you do so later in a debate and under specific circumstances. But we are going to talk about those. But before we get there, let's talk about what arguments you can kick in a debate. And it's on the screen. The affirmative team can kick advantages, and the negative team can kick all off-case positions that they read. Now, the negative team can also choose not to go for some of the on-case positions that they have made, but because we view on-case positions as more discrete arguments and just attacks upon the case rather than a position, like topicality is sort of this holistic argument, we don't really think of a negative choosing not to advocate for some of their case arguments as kicking. That's just sort of selective argumentation. I know a fine distinction, but that's why on-case negative arguments don't make our list of what you can kick. Let's talk about how we kick arguments. The method of kicking an argument really varies based upon the argument, and we are going to talk about, for each type of position that was on the previous screen, how you go about specifically kicking those arguments, but a few general pointers when you think about kicking arguments. First, you're always going to be conceding something your opponents have said. You are going to be saying, Judge, we agree that this argument is true, which takes out our disadvantage or our advantage. Second thing, you got to be really clear when you're kicking an argument. You can't be wishy-washy. If you're going to jettison an argument, let everybody know. Because you should be doing it for a strategic reason, and you don't want your judge or your opponents to get confused about what positions remain in the round, because that just is going to muddle the debate. Third big picture point for how to kick arguments, you've got to understand the distinction between offensive and defensive arguments, because it really dictates how, for particular positions, you go about executing kicking an argument. So if you haven't watched our video on offense-defense, go check that out. Let's start with advantages. Advantages and disadvantages have the same formula. You concede defensive arguments, and you answer any offensive arguments to kick it. So defensive arguments to an advantage would be arguments about why there isn't much of an impact, why the plan doesn't actually result in that advantage. Those are defensive arguments. Those are things as to why the advantage may not be as important, true, big, what have you. You concede those arguments. Those are defensive arguments again. Now, there could be offensive arguments. Maybe they have read an argument that your impact, which you say is good, is actually bad. Or maybe they make the argument that the affirmative plan makes the harms identified in the advantage worse. You have to answer those arguments if you're going to kick an advantage, because conceding defense may not be sufficient. Now, as always, there's a caveat. If, for example, the negative team impact turns an affirmative's advantage, so they say the affirmative says the impact is good, the negative says the impact is bad, but the negative also reads an argument that says, really, there is no impact here whatsoever. There just isn't one. It's not a big problem. The affirmative team can concede that defensive argument and take out the negative's offensive argument. So you wouldn't have to then go and answer the impact turn. You would just concede that defensive argument, which takes out all of the offense. But hopefully here you're beginning to see why it's important to understand offense-defense. Not only do you have to identify defensive versus offensive arguments in figuring out how to kick an argument, you also have to understand the relationship between a defensive argument and a type of offensive argument to figure out what do you have to concede, what do you have to answer. Disadvantages. Same principle here. The negative team concedes defensive arguments that the affirmative has read, maybe an argument the uniqueness isn't true, there's not a link, or there's no impact. They have to answer any offensive arguments, which, again, if you remember from our offense-defense video, is either a link turn or an impact turn. So, again, going back to what we just talked about, understand what type of offense you're dealing with so that you can understand what you have to answer, or if you can identify a defensive argument to concede that will take out that offensive argument. Final note about disadvantages and kicking them: beware of what we refer to as the straight turn. A straight turn is a fancy way of saying the affirmative has read solely offensive arguments against a disadvantage. Let's say the second affirmative constructive decides just to read 5 impact turn arguments against a disadvantage. That means there is all offense against that disadvantage. So the reason I mention this here is when you think about kicking that disadvantage, there isn't defense for you to concede to get out of that position. So you are stuck with it. And as a result, you really shouldn't think about kicking a disadvantage under those circumstances. But again, you need to be able to identify what has been straight turned versus what has not been straight turned. Topicality. This is a unique animal. Kicking topicality is really easy 99% of the time. You simply never talk about it ever again. That's all you got to do. You don't have to say, let's go to topicality. We're not going for it. You don't have to do any of that. There's no offense, defense that you have to concede. You just never bring it up again. The reason why is because topicality is not a reason to vote affirmative if the AF is topical. The AF proving they're topical is just part of the game. The fact that they've done that doesn't mean you vote affirmative. So there's no real downside to the negative just ignoring it for the rest of the debate. As I mentioned a moment ago, there's a caveat to just about all of the stuff on this video. There is a circumstance where you will have to deal with arguments on topicality if you want to kick it. And that's when the other team makes what we call reverse voting issues. That's a convoluted way of another team arguing that it's actually unfair for the negative team to read topicality, and therefore they should lose. So it's the affirmative team trying to turn topicality into something that hurts the negative. So if you don't want to go for topicality, and the other team has made those kind of arguments, you do have to respond to them before kicking topicality. Counterplans. Counterplans, similar theme at the beginning. You concede defensive arguments to get out of a counterplan. And defensive arguments are things like you're not going to be able to solve. Permutation is a defensive argument as well. You can concede that both the counterplan and the plan can happen at the same time. Caveat here, though, is you have to argue that the permutation is not an advocacy statement, meaning the affirmative doesn't get to stand up and say, well, hey, the negative has agreed we can do both of these at the same time, so you should vote affirmative to go ahead and do both of them. That's a really bad scenario for the negative. So you need to point out that the permutation is just a way of seeing if they can coexist, the plan and the counterplan. If they can coexist, then we can get rid of the counterplan. Third thing you have to do to kick a counterplan is answer any theoretical objections to the counterplan. We'll be doing a video on theory that you can watch, but theory is essentially a way of arguing that whatever the counterplan is, however it works, is unfair for some reason to the affirmative. So that kind of represents a topicality-like threat to the negative. So you got to answer that. Critiques. Identical to counterplans. Concede defensive arguments like no link, no impact, the alternative won't work. You can concede the permutation as a reason that you should get out of the critique. And then you obviously have to say that it is not an advocacy statement, and you have to answer theory. Now, if you're debating for Cheyenne East, chances are you're not going to be reading a lot of critiques. So not a big deal if you don't immediately grasp how to get out of critiques. But learn the others. Before we talk about the strategic reasons to kick an argument, let me mention what you cannot kick. The affirmative can never kick the plan. The affirmative must always advocate for the policy proposed in the 1AC. That really means, as a practical matter, when you think about kicking advantages, you should never think about kicking all of them. Only maybe one, or two if you've read three. And there might be some other circumstances where you could think of doing something else, but you're always advocating for the plan. The negative cannot kick what are called unconditional negative positions. Unconditional is a policy debate word that simply means the negative has told everyone in the round, we have read this argument and we are going to advocate for it throughout the entirety of the debate. If the negative takes that position, then they have to stick to it. They cannot get rid of that argument. All right, let's talk about the strategy behind kicking arguments, or why we do it. The first reason is shrinking the debate down by kicking arguments frees up time in speeches to deal with what we might think are really important issues or better arguments. So that funnel idea, as you get closer to the end, you get rid of arguments and free up time so that you can explain the winning positions. Second, sometimes you're just going to read a bad argument or read what you think is a good argument that turns out to be a bad one based on what the other team does or says. So this is an opportunity for you to get out of those bad arguments and bad positions and shift the debate ground somewhere else more advantageous to you and your partner. Third, you can kick arguments to exploit a contradiction. And this is most often where teams kick arguments. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. Let's say the affirmative has read an advantage that talks about the economy, and the affirmative improves the economy and prevents an economic downturn. Then the negative reads a disadvantage that also has an economy-based impact. They argue the affirmative actually causes the economy to go down, and that's bad. The 2AC, and I've seen this happen plenty of times, might get up and in their speech argue that even if there's an economic downturn, there's really not going to be a consequence from that because the economy is resilient or the economy will bounce back very quickly, but don't worry about an economic downturn. Well, that logically makes sense. It weakens the disadvantage because even if the negative proves that the affirmative weakens the economy, it's not going to be a big deal. But remember, the affirmative also made an argument about why an economic downturn would be bad. So this represents an opportunity for the negative to kick an argument to hurt the affirmative and exploit a contradiction that the affirmative has made. So the negative team would be smart in this scenario to kick the disadvantage by conceding a defensive argument that there really isn't much of an impact or problem from an economic downturn. That gets them out of the disadvantage. They can then also say, because they've conceded that argument and we agree it's true, that also means that the affirmative's advantage about an economic downturn also has no impact and really doesn't matter in the debate. So you see that there's that contradiction that the negative exploits. And what practically it's doing is you are sacrificing the disadvantage to take out one of the affirmative's positions. And if, for example, you read two disadvantages in your first negative speech, then you're still just fine. You still have a disadvantage, but the affirmative is now down an advantage. Fourth and final reason you kick arguments is to execute overall strategy. Maybe the negative strategy going into a debate is to go for a particular disad, but you have another disad and a topicality argument that you read in your first speech. You got to get rid of those if in the final negative rebuttal you want to focus the judge's attention on the disadvantage and maybe some case arguments. Likewise, if you are going for a counterplan and you need to jettison something to go for that counterplan, you should do that. Maybe an affirmative team, in order to explain the best parts of the affirmative case and deal with whatever negative positions have made it through all the way to the end of the debate, maybe they need to shrink the overall set of arguments in the affirmative so they jettison one of their smaller or weaker advantages based on what happens in the round and go for their stronger positions to win the affirmative is a good idea and cover the rest of the debate. But this all brings us back to debate is a game of strategy. Kicking arguments is an excellent way, when mastered, to execute the strategy you want and dictate the debate to your opponents.